It's September 17th, 1967. A Sunday night, prime time, CBS. Families across America have their televisions tuned to a variety show hosted by two clean-cut brothers in matching sweaters. The kind of program that looks, on the surface, like it belongs next to Lawrence Welk and Ed Sullivan. Then a British rock band called The Who starts smashing their equipment, and Keith Moon's bass drum detonates so violently that it knocks him off his drum riser, sends shrapnel into his arm, and singes Pete Townshend's hair down to the scalp. Smoke fills the set. Roger Daltrey is thrown halfway across the stage. And in the middle of that chaos, when the show's own host, Tom Smothers, watches Townsend grab his acoustic guitar off the ground and smash it to pieces, too stunned to do anything but stand there. The explosion is so loud that it briefly knocks the broadcast signal off the air in parts of the country. And here's the detail most people miss when they watch this clip today. Nobody trimmed it, nobody smoothed it over, and nobody buried it in an outtake reel. It went out largely as it happened, unscripted, uncomfortable, and unmistakably real. On a network that reviewed scripts line by line, argued over single words, and demanded finished tapes 10 days ahead of air, that one chaotic, dangerous, unplanned moment survived untouched, while entire songs, entire jokes, and entire guest appearances happening in the very same season were getting sliced of ribbons before anyone at home ever saw them. That contradiction is the real story here. Not a mistake that slipped past the censors, but a pattern in what they let through and what they didn't. To understand why that explosion made it to air, while so much quieter material never stood a chance, you have to understand what the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour actually was, and what it cost the two men who built it. Tom and Dick Smothers didn't start out as rebels. They started out as orphans of a war neither of them could remember living through. Their father, Major Thomas Bolin Smothers, Jr., was a West Point graduate station in the Philippines when Japan invaded in 1941. He survived the Bataan Death March, one of the darkest atrocities American soldiers endured in the Pacific Theater, and then spent years in Japanese prison camps, including Fukuoka. In the closing weeks of the war, the Japanese loaded him onto a transport ship bound for Korea along with hundreds of other prisoners. That ship was struck by Allied bombers who had no way of knowing American POWs were aboard. Major Smothers died in the wreckage of that mistake in the spring of 1945, one of the last of his group to die. Tom was 8 years old. Dick was 6. Their mother, Ruth, raised him largely on her own, working through the years that followed while her sons grew up without the father who'd never made a home. That early loss, an entire childhood shaped by a war that killed her dad by accident, would later sit underneath every joke they made about Vietnam. When Tom Smothers pushed back against a network that wanted him to stay quiet about an unpopular war, he wasn't performing outrage. He'd buried a parent because of one. The brothers found their way into show business almost by accident. Tom picked up guitar in college and put together a small folk group with a few classmates. Dick learned bass on the spot just so he could join his brother on stage. One by one, the other members drifted off to other things, until it was only Tom and Dick left performing together, filling the gaps between songs with whatever banter came to mind to cover the silence. The banter outgrew the music. Audiences weren't showing up for the folk tunes anymore. They were showing up to watch two brothers needle each other on stage, one playing the dim, wounded innocent, the other playing an exasperated straight man, forever setting him up for a line. Tom would complain that their mother had always favored Dick, and the crowd would howl, because it read as real even when it was a bit, and in a way it was real. It grew directly out of how the two of them actually talked to each other off stage. It clicked in a way neither of them fully planned. By 1959, they were booked for what was supposed to be a short run at the Purple Onion, a small club in San Francisco, and the crowds kept them there for months instead of weeks, turning a modest nightclub engagement into a genuine phenomenon and building the following that would carry them on to records. Within a couple of years, they recorded a live album taken from that same club scene that turned their nightclub act into a national name. And by the mid-1960s, they were established enough that CBS came calling with something much bigger than a comedy album. CBS had a problem in 1967, and the problem's name was Bonanza. NBC's long-running Western was drawing a massive share of the national television audience every Sunday night, and had already knocked off 2 previous CBS shows sent in to compete with it. The network was running out of ideas and running out of patience. Someone at CBS made a gamble. Put 2 young folk comedians in the slot, and see if they could pull in the audience Bonanza couldn't reach. The younger, restless viewers who didn't want another Western. Viewers who were starting to care more about Vietnam and civil rights than about cattle drives and gunfights. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour premiered in February of 1967, looking like exactly what CBS ordered. Ed Sullivan himself introduced the brothers as wholesome, all-American kids. The kind of introduction meant to reassure the network's older, more conservative affiliate stations that nothing too disruptive was coming. Within a few weeks, that wholesome packaging was doing something nobody at the network fully anticipated. The show made jokes about the Vietnam War. It mocked sitting politicians. It brought on musical guests who weren't just entertainers, but voices of protest. And it worked. The show started beating Bonanza in the ratings within its first couple weeks on the air, something almost nobody had managed before, and the young audience CBS wanted showed up in force, dragging advertisers along with them who suddenly wanted access to that demographic, no matter how the content made network executives feel. Part of what made the show dangerous was who was writing it. Tom negotiated creative control before signing on, and CBS agreed because they needed a hit badly enough to take the risk. That freedom pulled in a writer's room that reads today like a founding document of modern American comedy. Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, Lorne Michaels, David Steinberg, Bob Einstein, and others who would go on to shape Saturday Night Live, all in the family, and a generation of shows built on the idea that comedy could say something instead of just filling time. These weren't yet famous names. They were young, hungry writers testing exactly how far a network variety hour could push before it broke, and the Smothers Brothers gave them room to try. One of the show's recurring bits, a deadpan mock candidate named Pat Paulson who ran for president on a platform of contradictions and non-answers, became one of the sharpest pieces of political satire on American television years, before anyone thought to build a whole show around a fake news desk. The gag worked precisely because it never announced itself as commentary. It just let a straight-faced non-politician say the kind of empty things real politicians said, and let the audience draw its own conclusions. Another recurring segment featured a spaced-out, dreamy hippie character who dispensed advice loaded with slang that flew straight over the censors' heads, while landing perfectly with the show's younger viewers. Proof that the writers had learned to bury meaning in places the network wasn't looking. That room extended to musical guests most mainstream shows wouldn't touch. Between 1967 and 1969, the show hosted The Who, The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Buffalo Springfield, and Steppenwolf, acts whose songs carried real political weight. From Jefferson Airplane's warnings about nuclear war to Buffalo Springfield's meditation on unrest in the streets. In October 1968, the show aired the Beatles' promotional film for Hey Jude, followed the next week by their film for Revolution, giving American audiences their first network television look at what we'd now call music videos, only weeks after British audiences had seen the same footage. No other American variety show, not even Ed Sullivan's, had that kind of access. It signaled something bigger than a booking coup. Television itself was starting to bend toward the culture that was already reshaping music. Nowhere was that tension between the show and its network more visible than in the case of Pete Seeger. Seeger had spent close to 2 decades effectively frozen out of American television, a casualty of the anti-communist blacklist that had followed him since the 1950s. When the Smothers Brothers booked him in 1967, it was itself a statement. Seeger planned to sing Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a ballad about a platoon commander who marches his men deeper and deeper into a rising river against his own better judgment, a song widely understood as a direct jab at President Johnson's handling of Vietnam. CBS asked Seeger to drop the song's final verse, the one that made the metaphor explicit. He refused, and the network cut the performance from the broadcast entirely that September. Tom Smothers didn't let it go quietly. He made sure journalists knew what had happened, and the resulting public pressure pushed CBS into allowing Seeger back onto the show the following February. Millions of Americans finally watched him perform the song uncensored, the first time a blacklisted performer had used network television to criticize a sitting president so directly. It was a genuine turning point, a demonstration that protest music could break through the barriers built to keep it out. Harry Belafonte's appearance the following year showed just how far CBS was willing to go in the other direction. The show built a segment around Belafonte singing Don't Stop the Carnival, layered against footage of police confronting anti-war protesters outside the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. CBS pulled the entire segment before broadcast. What happened to the unused airtime afterward became almost as notorious as the cut itself. The network sold those 5 minutes to Republican campaign advertising, turning space meant for a protest against political violence into space that served the very political interests being criticized. Joan Baez ran into her own version of the same wall. When she appeared on the show, she wanted to dedicate a song to her husband, David Harris, who was about to serve time in prison for refusing the draft. CBS trimmed her explanation down to almost nothing before she was allowed to sing. By late 1968, CBS had stopped trusting the brothers with any margin at all. Every script, every lyric, every finished tape had to be submitted for review, and the network set the submission deadline at 10 days before air, an aggressive window designed specifically to choke off the kind of last-minute material that had made the show unpredictable in the first place. The writers, worn down by endless rounds of rewrites and rejections, started calling it death by 1,000 cuts. Tom and Dick answered with a sketch satirizing the censorship itself. Tom playing a network censor snipping performers off mid-sentence with a giant pair of scissors, the sketch ending on nothing but silence. CBS refused to air it. The show had reached a point where even a joke about being censored was too much for the censors. The final break came in the spring of 1969. CBS pointed to a missed submission deadline as the official reason for cancellation, specifically that the brothers had failed to deliver a finished tape far enough in advance for CBS and its local affiliate stations to preview it. Even though the show was still pulling strong ratings among CBS's top-performing programs and had just been renewed for another season only weeks earlier. Around the same time, Dick Smothers delivered an impression of President Nixon suggesting he'd end the Vietnam War as soon as he found the off button, a joke that landed exactly as sharply as it was meant to and rattled both the network and its advertisers. Sponsors like Ford and Procter & Gamble had already begun pulling back their ad spending over the show's political content, and CBS was staring at real financial pressure layered on top of political pressure, all of it compounded by growing scrutiny from a Nixon White House over what counted as acceptable broadcast content. On April 4th, 1969, the network canceled the show outright. An already taped episode featuring David Steinberg's pointed commentary on religion, material CBS worried will look especially inflammatory airing around Easter, never aired in the United States at all. It ran instead in Canada. The New York Times ran an editorial accusing CBS of turning its own creative talent into hostages, and public reaction was loud enough that CBS found itself doing damage control even as it stood by the cancellation. Tom and Dick didn't let the matter end there. They sued CBS for breach of contract, arguing the network had used a technicality to disguise what was really a political firing. The case dragged on for 4 years. In 1973, a federal court sided with the brothers, awarding them a settlement generally reported in the range of $775,000 to roughly $900,000, a legal victory that established a real precedent. A network couldn't hide behind a claim of editorial standards to punish performers for the substance of their politics. It was a win worth having, and it also couldn't undo what already happened. The show was gone, and nothing the brothers did afterward, not a short-lived run on ABC in 1970, not a 1975 attempt on NBC that started strong before internal conflicts and falling ratings sank it, ever fully recaptured what CBS had shut down. CBS, for its part, filled the vacant Sunday slot that same June with Haw, a folksy, apolitical country variety show with none of the Smothers Brothers' edge. It ran for more than 20 years, proof that the network's instinct towards safety over risk had been, at least commercially, the right bet for CBS even if it wasn't the right bet for television as an art form. The show's absence was felt outside television, too. Weeks after CBS pulled the plug, Jimi Hendrix took the stage of the Los Angeles Forum in April of 1969 and, before launching into a set, dedicated the entire show to a short list of people, including the Smothers Brothers, adding, almost like an epitaph, "God bless their souls." It's a strange, small detail. A guitarist known for setting instruments on fire pausing to mourn two comedians the way you'd mourn the dead. But it captures how quickly and completely the cancellation register across the culture show had spent 2 years trying to reach. Musicians who never appeared on the program still understood exactly what had been lost. The toll on Tom and Dick personally was real. Tom later admitted that losing the show hollowed him out for years, a wound that took a long time to close. Dick leaned into other interests to cope with the fallout. Both brothers carried the scars of that fight for the rest of their careers, even as later generations of comedians and writers came to treat the show as a foundational text. CBS itself brought them back for a 20th anniversary reunion special in 1988, reusing the old show's title and pulling several of the original writers back in for the occasion, and then for a full-fledged revival that ran 2 more seasons into 1989. But the political fire that had defined the original run never quite reignited in the same way. The world it had been arguing with had moved on, and so, in some ways, had television itself, which by then had absorbed plenty of the brothers' influence into its mainstream. In the fall of 2022, UC Santa Barbara's Performing Arts Collection took in the brothers' full archive, contracts, legal filings from the CBS lawsuit, photographs, sheet music, and recordings spanning their entire career. The archives curator described it as material that belonged in the same conversation as the country's most significant historical collections, a formal acknowledgement that what had started as a nightclub act built around sibling teasing had become, by the end, a documented case study in what happens when a broadcaster decides a comedy show has gotten too honest for prime time. Which brings the story back to that night in September 1967, to Keith Moon loading far more explosive charge into his drum kit than the show's crew had agreed to Pete Townsend's hearing damage for the rest of his life, to Tom Smothers standing in the smoke watching Townsend grab his own acoustic guitar and smash it to pieces on live tape. That moment stayed in the broadcast essentially as it happened, chaotic, unscripted, and unmistakably real, while a Pete Seeger protest song, a Harry Belafonte segment, and a sketch about censorship itself all got cut, trimmed, or buried by the same network in the same stretch of years. The explosion wasn't dangerous to CBS. It was loud. It made headlines. It gave viewers something to talk about at work the next morning, and it cost the network nothing, not one advertiser, not one angry phone call from the White House. The songs and the jokes that actually said something, the ones aimed at a war, a president, or the country's own conscience, were the ones that got the scissors.